everyone. I'm Allison Ames Gallstad, Director of the Coralville Public Library. I want to welcome you all to the Community Book Talk today. Thanks for coming to the library. We're grateful to John Kenyon and Nancy for bringing this wonderful event to Coralville. We love to collaborate with UNESCO City of Literature on events, and this is another wonderful event to bring to the community. So thank you for being here. Enjoy the library a little bit after the talk is over, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nancy.
I'm Nancy Willis. I'm on the UNESCO board, the local UNESCO board. UNESCO stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. We're one of only 6 cities worldwide to be designated as a city of literature. So we're definitely recognized as a community of writers, but we're also a community of readers. And the Community Book Talk is our opportunity to identify leaders and ask them to speak about a book that was instrumental in their lives or meaningful in some way. In that way, we can enhance the community dialogue about literature. Our first presenter will be Megan Flanagan. She is the managing director of the Coralville Center for Performing Arts. Megan's book is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf.
So in theater, a lot of times we talk about timing. We say it's all in the timing. And I think the idea of finding the right book at the right point in your life is when magic happens. So for example, as a young girl, I learned about the Little House books and then the Nancy Drew books, and that's what made me a huge reader. As a 16-year-old budding feminist, I found A Handmaid's Tale. As a creatively blocked college theater student, I found Coelho's The Alchemist. So this, A Room of One's Own was a similar situation. I was nearing the end of my college career, and I was writing a paper on female writers of the 18th century. Now, I knew from my research that Virginia Woolf had mentioned one of those writers, Aphra Behn, in this book. And I had the quote. I knew the quote was that all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. I didn't have the context of that quote, and this was before we just could Google that. So I actually picked up a copy of this book with the intention of, I was going to skim it until I found that quote. I'd read those couple pages, and then I'd move on. I ended up reading this cover to cover in one sitting. It was that powerful. So A Room of One's Own, it grew out of 2 lectures that Virginia Woolf was asked to give at women's colleges in 1928 on the subject of women and fiction. And the premise behind this book is so simple, but so revolutionary. If we want women to be adequately represented on our bookshelves, they need 2 things: £500 a year and a room of their own. So talking about resources, we give women the resources they need to grow as artists. So women, of course, were dependent at this time on their husbands, on their brothers, on their fathers. It hadn't been that long before that it was illegal for women to own their own property in England, for married women to own their own property. And yes, while they'd recently started having women's colleges, they were not nearly as well equipped as the men's colleges. There's some really great vivid passages in here where Woolf contrasts the men's college with its amazing library that she was not allowed to go into, its ornate buildings and ceremonies, and the meal. She describes this meal at a men's college with soles and partridges with all the trimmings, and elaborate desserts and wine glasses that flushed yellow and flushed crimson. I just think that's a beautiful image. And then she talks about going to a women's college for dinner with its simple bed sitting rooms. And, they ate plain gravy soup and stringy beef and prunes and custards. And she's saying, how can we expect women, if we don't give them the same resources as we give these men, to be able to create as wonderful things as they do? So it's, and the idea of the room of one's own, and she later goes on to say that that door needs a lock on it. It's not only about privacy, but also about time to oneself and space to create. And she's saying that women didn't have that. Now, this is not a work of fiction, but she does create characters. And I think the most lasting is that of Shakespeare's sister. She says, what if Will had had a sister who had every bit as much genius as he did? Well, she wouldn't have been educated. She would not have been encouraged to write. She would have been told to go do something constructive with her time. So in Woolf's imagination, Judith Shakespeare is betrothed to a neighbor's son, beaten by her father when she refuses the marriage, and runs away to London. Now, whereas Will was able to break into theater by holding horses at the stage door, Judith was mocked, called a prostitute, taken advantage of by an unscrupulous actor, found herself pregnant and alone, and killed herself, and was forgotten. So that, after that little bit of a downer, she does take us through a tour of women who were successful writers, starting with Aphra Behn, the woman I was originally looking to find out more about. Aphra Behn was the first woman to make her living as a writer, and she was scandalous, but she actually she paved the way for other women. And as an aside, this book, just to tell you how powerful it was, several years later, I named my cat Aphra after that. So after talking about Mrs. Behn, she goes on to Jane Austen, who, of course, wrote in the common sitting room. She hid the Pride and Prejudice manuscript underneath the blotting paper, and she was glad that a hinge creaked, so she knew someone was coming. Charlotte Bronte, who had so much more genius than Austen, but also had an anger pervading her works that marred that genius. George Eliot, who lived a scandalous life that probably enhanced her writing, but what could she have done had she been able to fight in the Crimea? And for that matter, what would Tolstoy have written had he been, away from the rest of the world, scandalously living with a woman not his wife, or, limited to Jane Austen's parsonage? And these are very real questions about how can we make women create? So I know this probably sounds very, very serious, but I'm going to borrow from Edward Albee and encourage you to not be afraid of Virginia Woolf. This book is short. It's very conversational since it came out of essays. It's really witty and humorous. She just has such a great way of writing. And while we do find anger, frustration, and sadness in here, it's also really lively, and it's full of hope and inspiration. In fact, she wrote the next year that one of the reasons she wanted to write this was because she wanted to inspire the young women. They seem to get so depressed. And so that's what she's trying to alleviate here. So the end of the book is full of encouragement. She's telling the women, yes, there are iniquities, but you know what? We've had women's colleges for 50 years now. You've had the right to your own property for 40. You've had the vote for 10 years. Don't make excuses. Go out there and create works of genius, because I want to see what you come up with. And she says, don't make excuses, make it happen. Go find a room of your own, earn $500 a year by your wits. She says, and support each other. She also recommends that they have 2 or 3 children rather than a dozen, which I think also could help with the creativity. But so she's telling them, this is what you can do to make it better. And I do think, the mark of a great book is, this was written 90 years ago. Does it still apply to today? And what is our contemporary equivalent of a room of one's own and 500 pounds a year? Is it education, access to excellent education for all, male and female, rich and poor? Is it, what about those women in the developing world? Do they need money and space to dream? The women in societies that don't value their contributions, how do we get them their 500 pounds and room of their own? Is it even something as simple as 3 meals a day, good health care, access to contraception? I mean, what is it going to take to make sure that everyone has that space to dream and the resources to create? What are we feeding our writers, our artists, our innovators, our scientists? Is it a sumptuous intellectual feast, or is it stringy beef and prunes? So, I think, like many things, this might raise more questions than answers, but I do want to end by reading you a little bit from the ending of this book and what Woolf is telling us as we finish up our time with her. She said, "I told you in the course of this paper that Shakespeare had a sister, but do not look for her in Sir Sidney Lee's Life of the Poet. She died young. Alas, she never wrote a word. She lies buried where the omnibuses now stop, opposite the Elephant and Castle. Now, my belief is that this poet who never wrote a word and was buried at the crossroads still lives. She lives in you and in me, and in many other women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting their children to bed. But she lives. And for my belief is that if we live another century or so, and have 500 a year each of us in rooms of our own, if we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think, if we escape a little from the common sitting room, then the opportunity will come, and the dead poet who was Shakespeare's sister will put on the body which she has so often laid down. As for her coming without that preparation, without that effort on our part, without that determination that when she is born again, she shall find it possible to live and write her poetry, that we cannot expect, for that would be impossible. But I maintain that she would come if we worked for her, and that so to work, even in poverty and obscurity, is worthwhile." Thank you.
Thank you. Keith Jones will tell us about Killing Lincoln by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. Keith has been a banker with Hills Bank and Trust Company and its predecessors for 28 years. Keith?
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you to the City of Literature for this opportunity. It's a real honor for me to share the podium with the other presenters today and be included in this group. As Nancy said, the book I want to talk to you about, and I have to tell you, I wouldn't say this is a book that has changed my life, but I will tell you that I have read a number of books about Abraham Lincoln, and that's one of the things that drew me to this, along with my wife, Connie, who listened to a review of the book and said, you really ought to buy that book because I'd like to read it and you should read it. And I will tell you right up front, it's written by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. I am not a Bill O'Reilly fan. I'm not a regular watcher of the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News. There's been much written about O'Reilly's personality, about his political leanings. In fact, I think many people have avoided this book just because of that. I will also tell you that this book has been criticized because of what have been called inaccuracies, historical inaccuracies in it. In fact, the National Park Service recommended that it not be sold at the Ford Theater bookstores. In fact, one of the bookstores there chose not to offer this book. But that being said, when I read outside of things that I read in my work life, I read strictly for pleasure. I like mysteries and I like history. So that's really what drew me to the book, along with the fact that I, like many Americans, have been fascinated by the life of Abraham Lincoln, his rise to the presidency and his years in office. And so that's really what brought me to read this book. It obviously it's a story that is a sad story, and you know right from the start it's a sad story because you know how the book is going to end. It really covers about a 2-week period, starting on the 1st of April, 1865, through Lincoln's attendance at Ford Theater on April 14th, his assassination on the evening of April 14th, and then his eventual death the next morning in a rooming house across the street from the Ford Theater. But I just want to read a couple excerpts from the book. I think the interesting thing about the book is that it's written in the present tense. Chapters are very short, very easy to read. There's really vivid details in the book, and there's a lot of emotion and suspense, even though, as a reader, you know how the book's going to end. Let me just read a note to the readers at the very start. The story you're about to read is true and truly shocking. It's been 150 years since the beginning of the Civil War, the bloodiest war in our nation's history, a conflict so full of horror it is almost impossible to describe. The assassination of President Lincoln only days after the end of the war was a terrible tragedy. Much has been speculated about the events leading up to the murder and immediately afterward, but few people really know what happened. Now, I'm not going to go as far as saying that Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard really know what happened, and I would say, if anything, they can be accused of maybe over-speculation in this book, but again, I still found the book to be a very interesting read. It's divided into 4 sections. The first section is Total War and really talks about the days leading up to the end of the war and leading up to Lee's surrender. And there's some really vivid detail of the battles that took place, the strategies that were used, that were being used by both the Union Army and the Confederate Army. It talks about the eventual surrender of Lee, and I think what I'm going to do is just share some of the excerpts from the book that in each of these sections. This particular paragraph is really talks about when Lee and Grant met, and Grant proposed the terms of surrender. As the moment of surrender nears, Grant starts to feel a bit embarrassed by the prospect of asking one of history's great generals to give up his army and has second thoughts about his dress. General Lee was dressed in a full uniform, which was entirely new. He will later write in his memoirs, and Lee was wearing a sword of considerable value, very likely the sword that had been presented by the state of Virginia. At all events, it was an entirely different sword than the one that would ordinarily be worn in the field. In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form. Of course, Grant was a very short man, so you can imagine not only the contrast in uniform, but the contrast in size. The other thing I found interesting in this section, it talks about Grant's actual terms of surrender, and these are Lee's words as he reads the terms. The terms are remarkable in their lenience. Lee will not even have to surrender his sword. The gist is simple. Put down your guns and go home. Let's rebuild the nation together. This was President Lincoln's vision to which Grant subscribed. And all through this book, it talks about Lincoln's, really his basic premise was to rebuild the Union. The second section of the book is the Ides of Death, and the Ides of Death is a section that talks really about what happened after the surrender. And just to give you a flavor of what happened in Washington, D.C., let me just read this real short paragraph. It seems like the entire town is drunk. Lee's Confederate Army has surrendered. In the Union, Capital whiskey is chugged straight out of the bottle. Church bells toll. Pistols are fired in the air. Fireworks explode. Newsboys hawk final editions chock full of details from Appomattox. Brass bands play. Church hymns are sung. 35 U.S. flags are hoisted. And Army howitzers launch an astonishing 500-gun salute which shatters windows for miles around the city. The war is done after 4 long years and more than 600,000 dead. The other thing that is, this section of the book also introduces you to John Wilkes Booth. And Booth was a Confederate sympathizer. He had a deep hatred for Lincoln. He believed in the institution of slavery, and he was really enraged over how the war ended, and he was intent on taking revenge against Lincoln because of that. The thing that I found extremely interesting in this section is how lax security was back in the 1860s. In fact, there's much written in this section about how the White House was totally open to the public. People could come in on the main floor of the White House and mill around. It talked about people coming into the White House and taking pieces of the drapes out. People would actually sleep in the halls of the White House, hoping in the next morning when Lincoln came down from his bedroom, they could get a few minutes with him. It's almost unbelievable. And it talks about some of his aides, how they really worried about all of that. Just a couple sentences here how Lincoln viewed that. Lincoln, however, reminds Hay was his secretary, that being President of the United States stipulates that he be a man of the people. It would never do for a president to have guards with drawn sabers at his door as if he were or were assuming to be an emperor. So that's a little different maybe than it is today. The third section of the book is the long Good Friday, and of course, if you know the story of Lincoln, he actually was assassinated on Good Friday. It talks about the activities of Lincoln that day, and it's really, that whole section deals with about 24 hours, if you will, from when he rises in the morning on April 14th to the events of the day, to his trip to Ford Theater. One of the things that was interesting is he and Mary Todd had a hard time finding anybody to go. He wanted to take some people with him. He originally invited General Grant and his wife, who turned him down because Grant's wife wanted to get out of town. So anyways, it's just interesting to see how that all plays out. That section is really the events of the day, and it's a pretty emotional section, ending, of course, with Booth's entrance into the theater, into the presidential box, and the assassination of the president at about 10:15 at night. Lincoln then passes away the next morning, again, at a rooming house across the street. They removed him from the theater, and he died at about 7:20 on the morning of April 15th. The final section of the book talks about the chase and really the events leading up to the pursuit and the capture of John Wilkes Booth. Was actually captured in a barn on a farm about 30 miles south of Washington, D.C. It talks about the other conspirators that were captured, the trials that led up to that. Part of this was a sympathizer who actually had housed Booth. Her name was Mary Surratt. Mary was actually executed by the United States, the first woman ever to be executed by the United States because of her help of Booth in his escape. Booth was actually shot in this barn, and then he, like Lincoln, died the next day, and talks about him being thrown on a garbage wagon and taken back into the city. Again, I am not a historian. I'm not going to debate the historical correctness of this book. I found it to be a very interesting read. I found information in this that I did not know about Lincoln. So I would recommend the book to you. It's a very quick read, and it's a very interesting read. It reads like a mystery, but I personally believe there's a great deal of historical fact in here. Thank you very much.
Margaret McCaffrey's family is a very welcome addition to our University of Iowa athletic community. Margaret, in her own right, was a basketball star, maybe still is. She was a standout for Notre Dame women's team, and she coached there for a time. Margaret is going to talk about a number of different books, so I'm going to let her tell you the titles of her books and the authors.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I'm here to dumb it down a little bit, I think. I went to Notre Dame. I was a government major, which is political science. They just call it government there. And took a lot of English classes, read a lot of books. And then I went to law school, and I read a lot more books. And so when I was asked to do this, I was trying to think, okay, what, can I go back to something that was really influential? And there were a lot of them. But really, since I had our oldest child between my second and third year of law school, and we left Notre Dame and went to Greensboro, where Fran was the coach, and proceeded to have 2 more children. So I never quite got my law career going. And then we moved from there to New York, and I still haven't gotten anything going. And then we went from New York, now we're in Iowa City, which we love, but I still find it hard to find time to read a whole lot of grown-up books. So we have 4 children, and probably the best part of the last 14 years has been spent in the evenings with our kids, laying there and snuggling and taking time to read together. And so what I thought I'd do is I picked a couple of our favorites. This one is it's in 3 pieces now because it's been read so many times. And we started not just when they were old enough to really understand. We started when they were babies, and we would sit in the rocking chair in the room and snuggle and read. And this is one by Gyo Fujikawa, and it's called Babies. And I think actually my mom and dad are here today, so Marit and Dick Nowlin. And I'm pretty sure my mom probably read this one to me. Not this exact copy, but she read this book, and she gave me this when I was pregnant with our oldest, Connor. So it has a lot of meaning, and it's just a very simple, babies are very little, soft, warm, and cuddly. They're always lying around eating, sleeping, laughing, or crying. They like to be changed and bathed and hugged and loved. Before you know it, they will be running and chasing all around, oh so busily, and do lots of things by themselves. And sometimes they are little angels and sometimes they are naughty, but good or bad, all babies like to be hugged and cuddled and loved. It's pretty simple and pretty true. And then we moved on to Moo Ba La La La. I don't know if any of you know about Sandra Boynton, but she's quite well known in the children's circles. And this one I actually gave it to our son when he turned 13 because I read it to him so many times. And it's pretty silly, but I think we ended up making up songs to a lot of these Boynton books. A cow says moo, a sheep says ba, 3 singing pigs say la la la. No, no, you say, that isn't right. The pigs say oink, oink, oink all day and night. Rhinoceroses snort and snuff, and little dogs go ruff, ruff, ruff. Some other dogs go bow, wow, wow, and cats and kittens say meow. Quack, quack, says a duck, and a horsey says neigh. It's quiet now. What do you say? And And then we have Big Red Barn by Margaret Wise Brown. I won't read you the whole thing, but most of these I know by heart. And what was really great was I remember taking our 4-year-old to his preschool class, and you could go in and read with them. And he had been read this so many times. He got this out, and he was so sure that he was reading, and all the other kids were just amazed that he was reading the entire book to them. And he just had committed it to memory. And same with this one. This is Googie Googie. And this was kind of a newer one. Well, I got it in 2004 from my mom and dad. Actually, it was for our boys. And Googie Googie is kind of a funny one. There was an egg rolling on the ground, and it rolled into a duck's nest. And you can see it looks a little different. This is the egg they're talking about. It's a little different than the rest of the duck eggs. But the mama duck sits on it anyway. And because she was reading, she didn't notice. And then all the the ducks all hatched, and they got one that is with the polka dots, and she called him Crayon. And then there was a striped one, and she called him Zebra. And the third one was yellow, and she called him Moonlight. And then a rather odd-looking duckling hatched from the fourth egg. Googie Googie, he said, and that became his name. And he goes around, and he was better at everything than everybody else. He was a lot bigger, and it came a lot more easily to him, but he just loved his brothers and sisters all the same. And then, of course, the alligators come, or the crocodiles, and they try to convince him that he should make his brothers and sisters jump off a bridge so he can eat them. And he won't do that because they try to tell him, you're really a crocodile, you're not really a duck. And he says, I'm a duck. And so instead of, he takes them all to the bridge, and he hatches a plan, and they throw these rocks down, and they break all the crocodile's teeth, and the crocodile run away. And they never come back. And then they have a big party, and we've made up a song, which I will not sing to you, but there is a song at the end that the McCaffrey boys know. And again, our 4-year-old brought this in and just read the entire thing. And it's wonderful to see how that, all of those influences. And then the last one is a book that is probably the most well-known in terms of a literary accomplishment. It's called Old Turtle, and I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a really neat way because, when you have children, you struggle about, well, some people do. You want to talk to them, teach them all these wonderful life lessons, and of course religion and God is part of that. And how do you, Fran and I are from different backgrounds, although pretty close, Catholic and Episcopalian, they're just about the same. But anyway, so we, felt like church was important, but we also wanted to talk about religion and God and have our children understand that there are lots of different ways to understand these things, not just one way in particular, at least in our opinions. So anyway, I felt like this was a beautiful book. It has wonderful illustrations, and it's about how all the animals talk, and they get together, and they have this, and they're arguing about what is God, and what does God do, and how does God bring things into the world. And then here comes Old Turtle, who is very wise, and he gets tired of listening to them argue, and everybody becomes quiet, and they listen to him, and he says, there will soon be a new family of beings in the world, she said, and they will be strange and wonderful, and there will be reminders of all that God is. They will come in many colors and shapes, with different faces and different ways of speaking. Their thoughts will soar to the stars, but their feet will walk the earth. They will possess many powers. They will be strong, yet tender, a message of love from God to the earth, and a prayer from the earth back to God. And the people came. And here they are coming, and the illustrations in this book are just beautiful. But the people forgot. They forgot that they were a message of love and a prayer from the earth, and they began to argue about who knew God and who did not, and where God was and was not, and whether God was or was not. And often the people misused their powers or hurt one another or killed one another, and they hurt the earth, until finally even the forests began to die, and the rivers and the oceans. Until one day there came a voice like the growling of thunder, but as soft as butterfly sneezes. Please stop. And then it goes on, and it explains, and eventually it says, and after a long, lonesome, and scary time, the people listened and began to hear, and to see God in one another and in the beauty of all the earth. And Old Turtle smiled, and so did God. So I think that all of these have wonderful messages about lots of different things, and it has been a pleasure for my husband and I to be able to lay with our children in the evenings and sit next to them and talk about things and read to them and snuggle. And that's all.
Makes me think it's nap time. All right. Christine Scheetz has been the CEO and president of the United Way for almost 5 years now. She is going to tell us about Wes Moore's The Other Wes Moore.
Thank you, Nancy. Margaret, I can't think of a better way, actually, to move into this book because it very much relates to that importance of the family's role within a person's life. It asks questions that relate to how we develop and how we become who we are, and that fine line of what distinguishes us from someone else's life. And how we connect with each other. When I think about actually the books that really, really changed my life, the Scheetz way up at the top of that list. I've been quoting it around the office in the same way. I was talking about it the other day. Everything that I believe in and that relates to social justice, that's where I learned it, in Dr. Seuss and all that wisdom. And my fondest memories are really about time spent reading. In fact, a family tradition for us around holidays is always reading children's books, or specifically, and some really strange things. One of our holiday classics is Steve Martin's The Cruel Shoes. If you've ever read it, I mean, it has nothing to do with the holidays, not necessarily one of those literary greats, but great fondness for those family experiences. I chose The Other Wes Moore because this book touched me really deeply and related to those themes about resiliency, about community, about empathy, about the opportunities that people have in their lives, about the connections that we make with one another, again, about social justice and about celebrating what is unique, recognizing the tragedies. I want to start just with Wes Moore's own words, describing that sort of sets the stage for what this book is about. It is subtitled One Name, Two Fates, so you know that there are two Wes Moores. This is a story of two boys living in Baltimore with similar histories and an identical name, Wes Moore. One of us is free and has experienced things that he never even knew to dream about as a kid. The other will spend every day until his death behind bars for an armed robbery that left a police officer and father of 5 dead. The chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. The tragedy is that my story could have been his. Those two sentences I come back to every single day. I mean, they just bring tears to my eyes, because think about that. The chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. The tragedy is that my story could have been his. Our stories are obviously specific to our two lives, but I hope they will illuminate the crucial inflection points in every life, the sudden moments of decision where our paths diverge and our fates are sealed. It's unsettling to know how little separates each of us from another life altogether. So this is how he finds out about the other Wes Moore. They both grew up not far apart, but in late 2000, the Baltimore Sun published a short article with the headline, "Local Graduate Becomes Rhodes Scholar." So Wes Moore, the writer of this book, this was about him, and he was excited. You know, he was a senior at Johns Hopkins University, and he'd received one of the most prestigious academic honors that the world knows. And so he was off to Oxford University on a full scholarship the next year. But there'd been this series of articles that also ran in the Sun around the same time. So he describes them. That story about him being selected as a Rhodes Scholar had less of an impact on me than another series of articles in the Sun about an incident that happened just months before, a precisely planned jewelry store robbery gone terribly wrong. The store's security guard, an off-duty police officer named Bruce Prothero, was shot and killed after he pursued the armed men into the store's parking lot A massive and highly publicized manhunt for the perpetrators ensued. 12 days later, the last 2 suspects were apprehended in a house in Philadelphia. The articles indicated that the shooter, Richard Antonio Moore, would likely receive the death penalty. The sentence would be similarly severe for his younger brother, who was also arrested and charged. In an eerie coincidence, the younger brother's name was the same as mine. 2 years after he returned from Oxford, this story was still with him. It just stayed with him and kind of burned at his soul. And he kept coming back to the question, what happened? I have to know. And he agonized over it, and he finally reached out and wrote to somebody. So lesson number 1 here is those thoughts that we have, so often we don't act on them. And he is affecting many, many lives just because he did a simple act of writing a letter and having the courage to put it in the mail to this man with the same name who was a prisoner. And he really, after he sent it, he kind of regretted it. He wondered about what, is this, if I made a mistake, am I being self-indulgent? And he thought about all of this. And about a month later, he gets a letter back that says, "Greetings, good brother." The letter started out, "I send you salutations of peace and prayers and blessings and guidance to you for posing these questions about how he got there, which I'm going to answer. With that, I will begin the first question." This all, it takes place in the introduction here. I mean, the important thing that he points out throughout this entire book and the heartbreaking stories that are told about the divergent paths that they went on. But both of them, it wasn't like one had a really grand life. It was just those simple moments throughout their lives where there were changes. Both the circumstances where they met with great adversity, family tragedies, loss, pain, very little income to survive on, and the things that made a difference. And of course, those things that make a difference are the people who surround us, the people who continue to believe in us when times are very, very difficult or give you a second chance. And then, of course, those decisions that we make that do change our lives, and when we make not the best choice, but continuing to learn. As you see, if you read this book, that Westmore, who is in prison, he has had every day to think about his life, about the choices, and to be sure that he is contributing. He felt very strongly that he was contributing to the world in a positive way by sharing his story. Westmore, the writer, spent a number of years interviewing family members, people who had been friends on the street, deeply searching some of those points in his life that he would have rather have forgotten about and moved on, but really wanted to understand those divergent points. He does say, most important, it is my sincere hope that this book does not come across as self-congratulatory or self-exculpatory. Most important, it is not meant in any way to provide excuses for the event of the day in February 2000. Let me be clear, the only events, that was the day of the robbery and the shooting, the only victims that day were Sergeant Bruce Prothero and his family. He's very clear that while there are stories here about points where the kids could be viewed as victims of circumstances, he never takes that approach, but he very much talks, and I'll leave you with what he says in the end of this being very much a call to action, to think about these words and the impact of people's actions on others' lives, particularly our children, and the impact that we can have on their lives. Above all, I hope that this book can provide young people with a way to identify with success as a possibility, and a reason to believe that a story that begins with struggle, apathy, and the pain of loss can still have a happy ending. I am eternally grateful to these new friends and countless others who have read the book and answered the call. So I encourage you to join in the number of people who have read this book and answer the call in thinking about what we can all do to affect the lives of children. Thank you.
Ryan West is our next presenter. He's Senior Vice President of West Music. He will be telling us, or reading from, P.D. Eastman, Go, Dog, Go.
Good afternoon. I, too, am not going to go too highbrow. Go, Dog, Go is the book I chose. And I chose it because I saw the posters, and I was speaking at something that said, this book changed my life. And I was trying to figure out what book was that changed my life. And it would be this one. The reason why I picked this book is this is the book that I taught myself how to read on. And so all of the books that followed were really thanks to some very basic lessons that we can all learn from Go, Dog, Go. I was reading it this morning, and I'm not going to read it all to you. I think I probably could in the next 5 minutes. And I'd be happy to do it afterwards. If you want to do a private reading session, I'm more than happy to. But in reading the book, what I realized and recognized in the language that's within the book is really identifying and illustrating and beginning these simple concepts of language. As the title has, Go, Dog, Go, you're repeating the word go. And as we continue to go through the book, it's introducing concepts of large and small, black and white, simple concepts that children can understand and can relate to, and can start to understand how these words, these things, these words on the page, this ink on a page, can actually take on more life and a greater life with it. So in reading this book, it was thanks to this book that I was able to have a lifetime of reading and can continue to enjoy a lifetime of reading. And partially because of that, spent 10 years in New York doing theater and doing acting. And in doing that and exploring the words of Shakespeare and exploring fiction and nonfiction and now kind of exploring the world of business over at West Music, it's all really thanks to the language of literature as well as the language of writers and writing. And so though a simple book, it is definitely a foundational book for this. And it really is thanks to that I can appreciate and enjoy this. This is much like some of the other stuff we were looking at of Old Turtle or any of the other books. It really is the idea of introducing these simple concepts that become the basis for a larger life in reading and in literature. And this is kind of the departure from, I think the quote on the back of this is, 10 years ago, Dr. Seuss took 220 words, rhymed them, and turned out The Cat in the Hat, a little volume of absurdity that worked like a karate chop on the weary little world of Dick, Jane, and Spot. And I think that it's a great quote, and this continues that there's exciting character development. There are dogs in cars, there are blue dogs, red dogs, yellow dogs, and not to give away the end, but to give away the end. I'll let you see the character development get there, but there is a giant dog party on the top of a tree at the very end of the book, which I always looked forward to as I read the book because I knew where it was going and where it was going to end, but I couldn't wait to get there and the journey of getting there by the end of the book. It really is an opportunity, and I think in that repetition and similar to what we saw, you going into school and being able to say, I can read this book. Maybe I didn't actually know the words on the page, but reading with my mom and having her read this book to me and know what the words say and then starting to put that concepts of the language to the words on the page is something that we all learned over the course of our life. And I think that that experience of reading with my mom, as well as learning the experience of reading myself, did change my life and continues to change my life and will continue to change it for the rest of as I continue to read a lifetime of reading. I think the last thing that I'd want to say about this book, besides that it is a great read, is the fact that, as we look at children's books and we look at writers that are exploring that, whether you look at Caldecott Medal Award winners, the combination of illustration, of the excitement of what's going to come next. If you think of, I think, Grover and the Scary Monster, there's a book, it's an old book, maybe some of you have read it, where he says there's a monster at the end of the book and it's kind of building that anticipation. And I think even if we look at that Abraham Lincoln book, knowing where the story's going, but then experiencing the journey as we get there through the literature and through the words of the writer is always a fantastic experience. So this book definitely changed my life. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, it's a quick read. And yes, thank you very much.
All right. Bill Hoeft is a screenwriter, and he serves on the Coralville City Council. I believe he's going to be introducing Paul Ettry, and the book is Ponseti and Paul.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. A little about me, I guess, before I bring Paul up, and the journey that I took to get to this book, and the reason it's life-changing for me is the actual journey that I took. I love stories where otherwise ordinary people do extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances. So I, like many in this community, was enamored and shocked and all the emotions with what happened with the Found family, Caroline Found and her mother Ellen, and what happened with the remaining family. So much so that I had the gall to contact Ernie Found and ask him for the honor of telling his family story, which he graciously did. Well, upon my 7-8 months now of interviews and background information and things like that brought me to Paul Etry, who is now I consider my lifelong friend, who recently released this book, Ponsetium Paul. And I'm not going to pretend to sit up here and tell you about it. I can't do it justice the way Paul can. All I can say is that if you want to read about two very purpose-driven people and a good way to pattern your life, this would be the two individuals that you would want to do that pattern and follow. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring up Mr. Paul Etry.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Coralville Public Library. I just live 2 blocks from here, so it was easy for me to come. Thank you all for coming. Why the hat? I don't wear usually baseball hats, but I will from now on because of these 2 people right here, the people that Bill mentioned, Caroline and Ellen Found. I worked with Ernie Found, the father, who's an orthopedic surgeon for the last 25 years. He became my brother. And I feel spiritually very united with the Found family. I knew Ellen very well. Ellen was the kind of lady who liked me very much like a brother. I could do nothing wrong in her sight. That was the wrong thing for her to think this way. But she was a wonderful lady, and I knew Caroline very well. So this book is in memory of Caroline and Ellen. Just to tell you a brief story, last year, the weekend of July 4th, Ellen was in the hospital dying from cancer. And she told Ernie that she would like to go to St. Louis and for the last time watch the St. Louis Cardinals. They were big fans of St. Louis Cardinals. The whole family loved, lived, breathed St. Louis Cardinals. Ernie had just was recovering from hernia surgery, and he couldn't really sit or drive. But he said, if Ellen wanted to go, even if I die, I'm going to go. So Ernie, Ellen, Caroline, and Greg, their son, took off to St. Louis and spent the whole weekend there. They watched 2 games. And that was a wonderful thing to do for Ellen, because a few weeks later, Caroline was killed. And then 10 days after that, Ellen went to heaven. So the Founds mean a lot to me, and today I guess the Cardinals will be playing this afternoon at 3, so I'll be rooting for them. The other thing I want to show you is another picture, and that's my mother, 93 years old. My mother is like Mother Teresa. She and my father were Christian missionaries of the old type. By this, I mean they lived by faith, and everything they did was by faith. They worked in Lebanon, they worked in Gaza, Palestine, where I grew up as a child, because they traveled a lot. They traveled wherever there was need. that's where they went. So I dedicated the book to my mother. And then the last picture is at the end. I have another picture. I like pictures. And this is my the love of my life and my daily companion. And it's not my wife. It's my dog, Winston. So this book basically tells the story of the people who impacted my life, who entered my life. Nancy, stop me anytime you want. I won't be offended. Because I can talk for hours. People, I am the product of the good people that the good Lord placed in my life. I'm going to start, and I mentioned this in my book, with Mrs. Little, Lytle, an Irish missionary, 75 years old, who spent 25 years in Lebanon. She lived downstairs, we lived upstairs. And when I hurt my knee and I was in bed for 6 months, she said, Paul, I want to keep your mind occupied. I can't just let you sleep in bed and sit in bed all day long. So she taught me the game of Scrabble. So every day she'll come up in the morning with her bags and the board and everything, and she'll have a grapefruit with her. And we play 2 or 3 games in the morning and in the afternoon. She used to beat me all the time until I started memorizing Webster's dictionary. And I was younger, I was very competitive, and even though English was not my mother tongue, I started beating her. And she was angry, and she's Irish, okay? You know how Irish people react when they lose. And then entered a young man, his name is David Minge, M-I-N-G-E, from Worthington, Minnesota, but he was a student at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. He came to our town, wandered our town. Our town was remote between Beirut and Damascus. And he wandered into town, and because my dad was a Christian missionary, the people told him, go see Reverend Etri. And my dad told him, we have no hotels here, why don't you stay with us? So he stayed with us, and he watched me play Scrabble. And then he played against me, and here he was a graduate student from St. Olaf, and I beat him. Then he asked me, Paul, what's your goal in life? I said, I have only one goal, and my goal is to come to the U.S. That was my obsession when I was a teenager, because I used to go to the American Library in our town and read every day after school. And I read all kinds of books, particularly the Wild Wild West and the cowboys and the Indians. And I just felt my soul really lived here. And so I told him, but my dad has no money. I had 4 brothers and 1 sister, and my dad lived by faith. He didn't believe in money. And every time I tell him I want to go to the U.S., I want to buy a ticket, or I need tuition money, he'd say, don't worry, God will provide. So enter David Minge, and when I told him about my love for America and I want to go to America, he said, well, give me your transcripts. 3 months later, I get a letter from the president of St. Olaf College saying that I heard about you, and I mentioned the letter is in the book, and we're going to offer you a full scholarship. Everything from clothing, tuition, room and board. And actually, this was an answer to prayer, and I came here, and every year I brought one of my brothers and sister, and at one time, the 6 of us were living together, along with my then girlfriend, Lois, who became my wife. And we all graduated. We all got degrees. I got 3 degrees without my dad investing any money. And I mentioned this. Is that it? Okay, thank you. Read the book.
Our last presenter is Rex Brandstatter. His book is Small But Ours by Mary Beth Sloniger. Rex is a 5th-generation Johnson County, Coralville resident. He's been a realtor since 1974. He is the Coralville historian. His grandfather was the Coralville town marshal in the 1920s into the early 1950s, and his grandmother was the Coralville town treasurer for 30 years. Rex.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the last guy in because that's the way it is. I was the last guy in the door here. So pleasure to be here. I am Rex Brandstatter, and it's fun to be here today to tell you about a book. It's called, written by Mary Beth Sloniger, and it's been on the market, been published many years ago here in Iowa City, called Small But Ours. And I told my wife, geez, they wrote a book about our bank account. Is that right, Jones? It's Keith Canning. So Small But Ours is an interesting book. It's not small, but the gist of the Small But Ours relates right direct to Iowa City, and I'll show you how you can make a book a lot more fun than just reading. And this is what I do a lot when I read books. I like books about Iowa City, Coralville, Johnson County, Iowa, to kind of localize them. So when I read a book and they give a street address, I get in the car and I drive to that street address and I sit there and then I read that chapter. In this book, Small But Ours, this is about basically the Czech people who came to Iowa, who ended up in Iowa City, and later the Germans who came here, and they settled in an area of town, roughly in the St. Wenceslaus church area in the northeast corner of Iowa City, and we all know it, we've all heard about it, called, oh boy, you learn pretty good, it's called Goosetown. And as a realtor, if you go up to Goosetown and you're trying to find your directions and show people homes, and if you look upon the street names, where it might say Bloomington and Center, Reno and Ronalds, on top of that street you'll see another little demarcation that the city of Iowa City's put in, a historic area. There's also a historic area up on Brown, but it'll say Goosetown, and it's got some little geese up on top. And thank God the frat rats haven't stolen all of them yet. And there are several of them there, but that shows you what happened. So why is it called Goosetown? That's the number one reason, because the people who came here from the old country, from back in Europe or there in Europe area, they brought with them geese, not dogs, not cats. Geese, because they could make a lot of uses for a goose, and you're thinking Christmas dinner. I know every one of you are thinking Christmas dinner. And that really wasn't the purpose of them with the geese. The geese provided a livelihood. It ate the bugs out of their gardens. They stripped the geese every year. They took some of the feathers and they made pillows out. They used the pillows for the family, for throws and things like that. And every once in a while they had to part with one when it got a little older, and they had to dispatch it, and that's what happened. But the geese became their watchdogs. The geese followed their kids to school. The geese kept people away from the gardens at night, and they became much more than geese. They had names for them, and they were their friends. Well, these people that came here were, if you will, hardworking, what we might call today the working class. And I want to read some of the jobs that they held. This is just interesting. Let's just. I'll start right off with bartender. Now, at one time in Iowa City, there were 4 breweries and 40 saloons, so their priorities might have been a little skewed, maybe some. That's probably when the Germans got here. Is that right? Well, I'm Brandstatter, so I can probably relate to that. Wallpaper painter, a baggage man, a butcher, a tinner. Now, that's John Schubert, who was a tinner. And when I was a kid, did any of you been here long enough to remember Schubert and Kadelka? All right, they were HVAC guys, heating, ventilation. And the Schubert and Kadelka, they were up across from Hamburg Inn number 1. That's where their last holding was. And they were tinners, meaning they came to your house and put tin up for the heat ducts and different things like that. A housekeeper, a nurseryman, a woodcutter, a carriage painter. Jewelry, domestic, china painter. Well, from the old country, this is what they brought with them. These were things that meant to them. In 1893, there were so many of the Czech people here that, and they were Catholic, that St. Wenceslaus Church, they went to the diocese in Davenport, and they said, all right, we're going to come to Iowa City, and in the real estate business, I call open a franchise. They're going to build a church, and they did. They built St. Wenceslaus Church, which is the church in Iowa City that is frequented mostly by the Czech people. Anybody here remember St. Wenceslaus Church? There you go, been married in St. Wenceslaus Church. The most impressed that I was of the people, the love they had for the families next door, the interest they took in the animals, in the garden. They were all gardeners. They talked about living on Davenport Street, Bloomington Street, and walking to work down in the area of South Muscatine Avenue, Muscatine Drive, Lower Muscatine. Walked to work, job started at 7 in the morning, they got off at 7 at night, and they walked to work. Figure that out. That's why they got to America. Mr. Etry talked about getting to America. That was their job, to get here. And they would send letters back and have people ask them to come to this country, and they might show up a year later. They had no idea if they ever even got the letter. So as you drive around the northeast part of town, I just go do this. Drive some of the alleys. I call this localizing history. I localized 913 Dewey Street, 813 Dewey. I thought, 813 Dewey, why does that ring a bell to me? So I drove to 813 Dewey, and lo and behold, one of my own for sale signs was in the front yard. Well, it wasn't the house that would have been there in the 1870s or 1880s, but I took that house off the landscape, and now I could see the house in the picture of this book, and I could see the people who lived there. Bloomington Street East Bloomington Street was considered the Mecca. John's Grocery downtown was a meeting hall. The CSPS Hall up on the north side was their meeting hall. The CSPS Hall, that stands for 4 different Czech names to put together in a society, and that's what that means. So I went into CSPS Hall, which is now Pruschel School of Music, for any of you who have kids over there. And on the wall, there's all kinds of pictures of the old-timers who were there. So if you like to localize history, have some fun. If you're interested in real estate in that end of town, and learn more about who came here before we did, and some of the names of the families that are still here, you should probably go check this book out. They have it upstairs. Small but ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. John Kenyon wanted to say just a few words before we adjourn.
Well, hi, I'm John Kenyon. I'm the Executive Director of the City of Literature, and I just wanted to thank all of you for coming out today. I wanted to thank our panel for coming out. And as Rex was talking about the book, it's actually not upstairs, or they might have copies up there, but they also have a cart over here with all of the books that folks talked about today that if you were intrigued by any of these descriptions, you can check those out. I also wanted to thank Nancy for moderating, and to Willis & Willis and Security Abstract Company for sponsoring our event today. They helped to provide the cookies that are over there. The Coralville Public Library provided the coffee, so make sure you grab some of that before you leave. Thanks again to our friends at Coralville for hosting us. You have a copy of our annual report in front of you. I hope you take that with you and take a few moments to look through that. Our organization has accomplished a great deal in the last fiscal year and are hoping to do so again, and we hope you can take a look at that and see about some of those things that we have done. And with that, we are adjourned. So thank you.